Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Stimson Center. We're going to get started. My name is Brian Finlay. I'm the president and CEO here at Stimpson. Thank you for making the time to join us for what I am confident will be a lively discussion on infrastructure investment and development efforts in the Indo-Pacific. As you are aware, the U.S. government released its strategy just over a month ago when Secretary Pompeo made his announcement. I'm proud to say that Stimpson has really emerged, I think, as a center of excellence certainly on the region, on the Indo-Pacific region. And my colleagues, some of whom you will hear from today, have played, I think, an outsized role in promoting, I think, an active discourse on America's role in the Indo-Pacific. And today will be no different. If you do not know their work, I encourage you to visit our website and learn a bit more about Stimpson's work, broader work in the region. We're extremely pleased to be joined today by Cleet Willems. As all of you in the room, I suspect, know, Cleet serves as the Deputy Assistant to the President for International Economic Affairs, and in that role he advises the President more broadly as well on issues of global development and international trade issues. Cleet, when you work in any White House, I know that it is not easy to break free, and so we're very grateful. Maybe while you're sitting at your desk at 11 o'clock tonight, because all of the work that you didn't get done right now you're having to do, you will regret this decision. But for now, we're very pleased that you're starring in this show for us. I also understand that you are the architect for a lot of the initiatives that we will be talking about here today, which, by the way, are garnering broad bipartisan support in this town. For all the partisan rancor that we hear incessantly in this town, I think we at Stimpson continue to believe in a nonpartisan agenda that promotes American interests around the world, and we are deeply grateful for public servants like you, Cleet, who equally embody that ethos. Thank you for your service to the country and also for being here today. My last order of business is to introduce our MC for today's event. Brian Eiler is a senior fellow and also directs our Southeast Asia program here at Stimpson, and more broadly directs our work on energy, water, and infrastructure issues more broadly. He came to Stimpson having spent more than 15 years living in the region. He speaks Chinese like a native. We'd like to get him to do party tricks for us, and maybe he'll oblige later today. He is really the Svengali of South Asia for us, Southeast Asia for us, and we're really grateful for his innovation and the really remarkable work that you do here at Stimpson. Again, if you do not know that work, I don't know what rock you have been living under, but you should check out his work more broadly. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Brian Eiler.
Thank you. The U.S.'s free and open Indo-Pacific strategy is one that promotes a rules-based order, stimulates competitive markets and transparency, and utilizes the actual comparative advantages of countries in the Indo-Pacific. When the sea change comes, and I believe it's coming soon, it could level the playing field for filling the $1 trillion investment gap in the Indo-Pacific and provide a clear choice for high-quality infrastructure that will greatly improve the socioeconomic and environmental outcomes in that part of the world, as opposed to sending those countries into cycles of deeper debt, dispossessing communities, and wrecking the natural resources bases of those countries. So today we've framed our event around convening government stakeholders and private sector stakeholders. There aren't any policy wonks like me up here that will be presenting information. We want to hear about their objectives, their aspirations and strategies, and the gaps that need to be filled in order to bring about this sea change. We're going to hear about new institutions like the International Development Finance Corporation and some numbers like $60 billion, which can really be put to use to make a difference in the region. And since we only have government and private sector participants today, we hope to call on you, many of you from the policy community, to engage in a productive discussion during our Q&A session. Please allow me to briefly introduce how we're going to run today's event. Today's event is on the record, and each keynote speaker, of which there are two, hopefully will engage the audience at his discretion for one or two questions. After what was going to be Congressman Yoho's keynote speech, unfortunately, the Hill vote got moved up to 3 o'clock, and the congressman could not join us, but he has kindly dispatched his communications director to deliver the speech in his stead. After that speech, we're going to take a minute to do a quick stage change and get ready for our panel discussion. We hope at the end of our event today to have a 20-minute discussion with all of you. And that also includes those tuning in on our live stream to hear your thoughts. For those of you on the live stream, or even those in the audience, you can pose questions or comments via Twitter. And please use the hashtag StimpsonNow if you are going to do that. My colleague Courtney Weatherby is monitoring this, and she will raise her hand if a question comes in over the social media waves. So to kick things off, it's a real honor to have Cleet Willems here with us, Deputy Assistant to the President for International Economic Affairs and Deputy Director for the National Economic Council. This is my first opportunity to meet you, Cleet, and I've heard that you are the chief architect of the infrastructure and development side of our Indo-Pacific strategy. So it's a rare chance that we get to hear from those present at the creation, if you will. Cleet serves as the Senior Advisor to the President on Global Development and International Trade. As a member of the National Security Council, Mr. Willems serves as the Senior Advisor to the President on Global Development and International Trade. Mr. Willems was most recently Chief Counsel for Negotiations, Legislation, and Administrative Law at the Office of U.S. Trade Representative, a position he started in June 2015. Previously, he was a legal advisor to the U.S. mission to the WTO and Assistant General Counsel at the USTR. From 2007 to 2009, Mr. Willems worked on the Hill Budget Committee immediately after serving as Legislative Director for Representative Paul Ryan. Ladies and gentlemen, Cleet Willems.
Is this on now?
There's a button to push. I'll turn mine off.
All right, can everyone hear me now? Excellent. Well, thank you for the very kind introduction. I mean, it is a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the Stimson Center for hosting this important discussion. The good news is that I'm not going to be at my desk at 11 p.m. tonight. The bad news is the reason for that is because I'm going to be on an airplane on my way to Argentina for the G20 Sherpas meeting. So I'm not sure I'm going to have the most rest in my life tonight, but at least I won't be holed up in the office. I'm excited to be here to talk about this, to talk about development finance, and to talk about the U.S. efforts in the Indo-Pacific region. I think, as was mentioned at the outset, this is something that is really near and dear to my heart personally, but I certainly cannot take credit for it. It really has been a team effort. I think it's something that the National Security Council has worked very hard with the Office of Management and Budget in the White House on coming up with the Development Finance Initiative, and we've worked very closely with a lot of great allies, both in the business community, with the think tanks and NGOs, and then of course with some excellent leadership on the Hill, both in the House and the Senate. Obviously, Congressman Yoho is a leader for us in the House. Okay. And we really appreciate all his leadership efforts in getting the Build Act passed through the House. We're quite optimistic about the Senate as well. So I'll get into that in a moment, but I just want to start by laying out the vision for all of you. The Trump administration is wholly committed to expanding our economic engagement in the Indo-Pacific region. I think Secretary Pompeo said it well at the event in July when he said the American people and the whole world have a stake in Indo-Pacific peace and prosperity. That is why the Indo-Pacific must be free and open. And this is true in other parts of Asia, and it's true around the world, Africa and Latin America as well. And we know that when infrastructure is financed with transparency and accountability, without transparency and accountability, and it's not sustainable, countries are slowly finding out that they aren't achieving the development aims that they hoped for, and instead they are finding themselves increasingly indebted and in a more vulnerable position than they were beforehand. I don't want to get into all the nitty-gritty, but I think that many of you here who have looked at this issue and studied this issue know some of the most prominent examples. There's a $1.2 billion port infrastructure project in Sri Lanka that went bankrupt. I think you see what's happening now in Pakistan. A whole series of unsustainable loans are coming due, and Pakistan's economy has been in trouble as a result. It's had to devalue its currency. Malaysia is running into similar problems that were financed in a non-transparent way, and ultimately they are having to revise and review what those projects, and ultimately you have something also happening in Kenya where there's some buyer's remorse. And so I think we see this happening around the world, and we believe in the importance of promoting development, promoting growth through financing these kinds of projects, but we want to do it in a way that's transparent, a way that's sustainable, a way that employs local workers, a way that brings in and catalyzes private sector investment so you have really lasting outcomes that can move the country forward and up the development chain. And that is the kind of model that we're promoting. The president has talked about this when he was at the APEC forum last November. He said that the United States is committed to reforming our development finance institutions so that they better incentivize private sector investment in your economies and provide strong alternatives to state-directed initiatives that come with many strings attached. And that's what we're trying to do here. I'm really excited that with the progress we've seen on the Hill. I think, as was mentioned at the outset, this is a bipartisan effort. And if you look at the BUILD Act, which Representative Yoho has led in the House, which has Senator Corker and Coons in the Senate, and which is wholly consistent with what the president proposed in his budget in terms of reforming these development finance institutions, it has something for everyone. And I think those who traditionally support America playing a leading role in development will like what they see. You have something that is giving our development finance institutions new tools that they've never had before. It's strengthening the institution, increasing the size. And I think from a development standpoint, we're going to see much better results. I think if you look from a business perspective and you look from a conservative perspective, you have a piece of legislation that really is focused on transitioning away from a model based solely on grants into one based on other tools, loans, and also different kinds of investments that bring in the private sector. And so what you're really doing is I think it's a good government model where you're getting more bang for your buck. And so the United States can make an investment and really crowd in a lot of additional investment from the private sector. There's also a good governance element where we're taking redundant functions across the government and bringing them together and consolidating them. So I think whether you're in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, whether your focus is on the business community, on development, on good government, there's something for you to like here. Obviously, there's also a strong foreign policy component that I've alluded to today. And I think I've been, I haven't been specific on the different kinds of projects that we're talking about, but I think anyone who studies this know that the United States is increasingly concerned about China's efforts in the region and the types of investments that they're making, what it's doing to different economies, and what it's doing for China to advance its strategic interests. And we want to find a way to provide a clear choice, to provide a clear alternative, and that's really what this is all about. So I think the legislation going through the Hill hits all of these different benchmarks. I think if we can get this through the Senate, and we're working on that, and we're making progress, this will be one of the most significant pieces of development legislation, I think, in about 15 years. And I think it's really a testament to all the different leaders who have been involved that I mentioned in the administration and at the Hill. This is one big piece of our engagement in the Indo-Pacific, but I did want to also touch on a couple aspects that Secretary Pompeo talked about in the forum in July, because I think they're also important. And this is, I think there were 3 different initiatives that were mentioned. The first is the Digital Connectivity and Cybersecurity Partnership. And this is a partnership through which we are going to try to improve partner countries' digital connectivity and expand opportunities for U.S. technology exports. And in addition to establishing public-private partnerships to build digital infrastructure, this initiative is going to deploy technical assistance to improve partner countries' regulatory policies and cybersecurity. The second element of that is the Infrastructure Transaction and Assistance Network, which is a whole-of-government effort to support productive infrastructure investment. And there's going to be a new interagency body led by the National Economic Council, where I work, to help coordinate U.S. government efforts to assess projects, to direct development finance, hopefully with a whole new set of tools, and to provide technical assistance as well. And finally, the last one is Asia Edge, which is about strengthening energy security and promoting energy access across the Indo-Pacific. And so this one as well is very focused on bringing in the private sector and helping use our private sector tools to really lead to new development initiatives. So one thing that is consistent with all of these is that they signal clearly the U.S. engagement and focus on the Indo-Pacific region, and they focus our interest in working with partners and allies in the region, with those who want to do development in a transparent, accountable, sustainable way to work together and provide a clear choice. And so I hope that's a helpful overview of what we're working on. I'm really excited that all the interest in the room on this issue, and would be happy to answer any questions. So thank you very much.
We'll field some questions from our audience. Thanks. And please introduce yourself.
Sure, thank you, and thank you for being here. My name's Anshu. I'm with Inside U.S. Trade.
How you doing?
Doing very well, thank you. And I just wanted to ask you if you could give us kind of like a trade update on what's going on in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, obviously, TPP was kind of the previous administration's cornerstone, and President Trump has withdrawn from that in favor of bilateral deals. But to date, I don't think any have been formally launched. And there's there's a lot of trade activity going on in the region. So can you just comment on where we are in terms of trade in the region? Thanks.
Yeah, no, I can do that briefly. I mean, I think, obviously I've talked a lot about our development initiatives, and I think they do show that the U.S. is very engaged in this region in an economic sense. And we want to continue to partner with countries around the region and help promote economic growth, help promote economic exchange. Another way you can obviously do that is through trade. And I think when I look at the region, there's 2 elements to it that I would highlight for you. First is the building the relationships and figuring out ways we can enter into new agreements. And this administration is committed to doing that. We have engaged with Korea to address some of the concerns with that agreement, and I think to improve it. We are also very interested in finding new partners to work with in the region. Japan has been someone for a long time. We've talked about our interest in trying to engage bilaterally. There are others and that are in the queue that we're working with, and I think you're going to see more progress there. The other side of this, obviously, that there's a lot of interest in is the China angle. And we have been in conversations with China about how to promote fairer trade and to ensure that China is playing by the rules. And this is a tough issue. I will be the first to admit that. But it is something that the administration is committed to, because ultimately, much like what we're seeing in the development space, when countries don't play by the rules, it affects others around the world. And we are not trying to constrain China's growth. We are not trying to stop China from growing. But China needs to do so in a way that respects other countries and doesn't harm them in the process. And we're in conversations with them about how they can do that in a way that respects, I think, the rules of trade. And obviously, thus far, we haven't yet gotten the result that we want to. But we are continuing to let them know. What we need here is to see them address the legitimate concerns we have raised time and again, that other countries like the EU, Japan have raised. And if we can address those problems, we can put things on a better trajectory. So that's a little bit of what's going on in the trade space.
Hi, Chia Cheng with United Day News Taiwan. 2 questions, if I may. First, could you update us on the new tariffs imposed on China? And then the second one is, you've mentioned South Korea and Japan. What about Taiwan? Does the United States have a plan to enhance the trade relationship with Taiwan? Thank you.
Yeah, on the tariffs, I don't want to talk only about trade issues today. I mean, I do want to get into the development stuff, which is very important to us. I'll just say, as I indicated in my previous set of remarks, we've been very clear with China on the kinds of things that it needs to address. These are longstanding issues that we've raised, that others have raised, and the best way for us to put the relationship on a sustainable trajectory is to have them address those problems, and we hope that they'll do so soon. With respect to Taiwan, obviously, that is a relationship that's important to us as well, and we want to continue to engage economically with them and to build that relationship.
Let's see who has a question on development finance. Hunter.
Thank you. Hunter Marston with the Brookings Institution. Part of the reaction or response from China regarding Pompeo's announcements and some of our latest initiatives are to sort of look at the numbers and the dollar amounts in comparison and kind of scoff at them. But I believe that the U.S. has other strengths that we can sell. How do you offer an alternative that is based on our strengths, private sector, not just SOEs and major corporate government-owned or investment? Thank you.
No, I think that's a great question. And I would say, number one, if you look at the way that we're engaging in this, we are doing it in a way that is intentionally meant to catalyze more private sector investment in those economies. We're trying to engage in projects and financing that employs local labor, that actually helps the economy in a way that I don't believe China's projects do. And so I think you can't only look at the dollar figure and say, oh, more money there, it's a better deal. You need to look at the totality of it and say, okay, is this deal here going to do more for my economy over the long run, or is that deal over there going to do it? And I think if you measure it by that standard, we're going to come out far ahead. The second point I would make is that a lot of what we're trying to do with our development finance reform is to put in place tools that allow us to more easily partner with other countries who share a similar market-based approach, who share a similar commitment to transparency and sustainability. And some of the tools in here, like equity, for example, is a tool that we haven't had before. We've heard from our partners that there are certain projects we haven't been able to enter into with them because we didn't have that tool. And they were investing equity. The United States didn't have that ability, and so we didn't end up doing a deal with Japan or Australia or someone else who we wanted to. And so the idea here is, again, the United States is not going to do this alone. We're going to do it with others. And I think between working with a set of like-minded countries, as well as having investments that are more focused on catalyzing additional investment, when countries work with the U.S., when they make that choice, they're going to see a much better long-term impact. And I think it's going to make up for any differential in financing.
Last question.
We can do both. You guys had your hands up at the same time.
For sake of time.
Oh,
So there's a growing trend of authoritarian regimes in the world generally. And
could you introduce yourself?
My name is Chatrachap from the VOA, the Cambodian service. So there's a growing trend in authoritarian regimes around the world generally, and especially in Indo-Pacific and even Southeast Asia, most of the countries, especially, for example, Cambodia. How does the U.S. plan to engage in all these investment activities with these regimes while there's backslides of democracy? For example, in Cambodia right now, is going to a single-party country government, and the U.S. is actually putting sanction on the countries. And now the effort to engage with these countries, like for example, Cambodia, to development for the projects, how does the U.S. going to do that? And does it contradict with the efforts to actually promote democracy and punish those who actually destroy democracy and human rights?
No, thank you for the question. I mean, obviously, you have to take each situation on its merits. And I think if you look at the way that the U.S. has engaged, and you look at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, for example, we have a set of standards that countries need to meet in order to engage in compacts with us. We believe that those standards help promote economic growth. They help promote democratic principles. They ensure local government buy-in. And I think that we will proceed with those kinds of metrics in mind through the MCC, and also with development finance as we're selecting projects. It's going to be important to us that what we're doing is working with countries where there is buy-in, where there is an opportunity, and then as much as possible, we want to be working with private sector. And again, I think the long-term solution here for all of these countries is not through governments alone. It's by ensuring that you have the conditions, that the government creates the conditions, enabling environment for that growth, and then the private sector is the one who's really making these investments that can take off. I work for the government, and I wish we could solve all the problems in the world, but we can't. We have to be very strategic about how we do it and find the places where we can actually do a little bit and achieve a lot by bringing in the private sector. So I think I have time for one more, and I know you had your hand up.
Hi, I'm Ruby Mellon. I'm with the Washington Post, and actually this was a question about that. How are you incentivizing, especially U.S. companies and tech companies to get on board with this and invest more?
Yeah, I mean, lots of different ways. I mean, I think, we have at this time, I mean, I look at Ray Washburn at OPIC, who's really just a great spokesman for these kinds of initiatives. And he is consistently engaging with the private sector, trying to find partners to come in. We have many trade missions and different trips by high-ranking government officials to these countries and trying to work with them to figure out who they can partner with. And then a lot of it comes from the governments themselves. And we just say, look, this is the kind of model we're going to bring. Help us work with you to identify who the right partners in your country may be. And so there's, it's kind of an all of the above approach. But again, we think that is the right way to do this. And I hope that we start hearing more and more from companies who see this as a good opportunity to work with us. And like I said, I really hope we can get that legislation passed soon, so that we have the full range of tools at the right size, so that we can work more and more with the private sector. And I think, again, like I said, I just want to conclude by saying what an exciting development this is, what an exciting time it is to be working on these issues. And I think if we get our Reform Development Finance Institution up and running, you're really going to see some positive results in the region and throughout the world. So thank you very much for your interest in this and for the opportunity to chat with you today. Thanks.
Thanks for coming in.
Yep.
Thanks. We look forward to hearing more
Next
about
time we'll get my
programs.
mic,
I think we got it straightened out. Thank you so much. Thank you. So to invite our next keynote speaker, unfortunately our next keynote speaker could not attend because, again, the vote was moved to 3 p.m. We're going to have Representative Ted Yoho's Communications Director, Brian Cavaney, deliver Representative Yoho's remarks. Lately, I've become a big fan of Representative Ted Yoho's tenacity and his intrepidness on promoting a new way forward for U.S. foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific, and that comes squarely with his authoring of the BUILD Act. I think at the heart of his philosophy, he's looking to positively impact development and economic outcomes in the developing world, but also keeping U.S. interests at heart. Creating U.S. jobs, creating U.S. investment opportunities is really at the core of his strategy. To give a brief introduction to Representative Yoho, he is a representative of Florida's 3rd district, which includes Gainesville, the University of Florida, and arguably the best parts of Jacksonville. He is the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee Chairman and co-author of the BUILD Act. He was elected to the 113th Congress in November 2012 and won re-election for his third term in the 115th Congress. And again, he is the co-author of the BUILD Act and also chairman of the House Subcommittee on Foreign Affairs. And to speak in his stead is Brian Cavini, Communication Director for Ted Yoho.
Hello, everybody hear me okay with this mic on? Right? My apologies for not being Congressman Yoho. So if you want a full refund for your tickets, you can talk to my colleague Brian in the back. The Congressman thanks the Stimson Center for giving him the opportunity to share his thoughts on U.S. engagement in the Indo-Pacific region and for development finance. I'm going to give his remarks as prepared. As everyone in the room knows, the world's strategic and economic gravity is shifting eastward. For the United States, Asia has become the essential arena where we must compete to advance our economic interests and defend the peaceful, rules-based order that has underwritten global security and prosperity for decades. The region itself is changing and maturing. Asian nations are reaching new stages of development, bringing new needs, mainly in infrastructure and interconnectivity. In antiquity, the Asia-Pacific was the hub of human economic activity. Now, the region is once again a driving force in commerce. This time, in a globalized world economy. As potential and opportunity takes root in Asia, so does challenges. Unmet infrastructure needs hamper growth. Democratic and human rights crises proliferate. Cross-border threats like crime and terrorism bring instability. Weather events can cause sudden massive losses. These rising stakes make it necessary for regional powers to follow consistent and thoroughly implemented strategies. China, our primary strategic competitor, has mastered such long-term thinking. When Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, China's Communist Party laid down two goals for the 100th anniversary of the party in 2021 and 100th anniversary of the PRC in 2049. These centenary goals are waypoints on the way to the mythical rejuvenation that the Communist Party promises in return for totalitarian rule. Many of the strategies that Xi and the CCP are taking to accomplish these goals, such as the Made in China 2025 Industrial Plan, threaten the United States and the rules-based international order at large. When it comes to regional geopolitics in Asia, the relevant strategy is Xi Jinping's signature Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. The BRI is responsive to serious infrastructure needs, but it is raising well-founded fears about debt-trapped diplomacy and economic imperialism. The Belt and Road is studded with white elephants, which export excess industrial capacity and Chinese labor, and enriches corrupt officials with little benefit for local communities and leaves developing nations beholden to Beijing. These indebted partners are right to be concerned. There's no evidence that a dominant China will behave as a responsible stakeholder. To the contrary, we can look at how China has acted since emerging as a modern military power. Instead of contributing to regional security, China has sparked territorial crises from the Himalayas to the East China Sea. Again, antiquity can be informative. It may be the ultimate goal of such strategies is to return China to its once dominant position, the unchallenged regional hegemon at the center of a constellation of tributary states. In this context, the United States is advancing a very different vision for the region. The free and open Indo-Pacific strategy promotes our partners' sovereignty, autonomy, and freedom of choice. While the overall goal of increasing the United States' strategic focus on Asia is consistent with long-standing U.S. policy, the Trump administration has done something new by creating a unifying theory that underpins the strategy. The United States will advance two principles through our Asia strategy, described by the words free and open. These principles will guide U.S. policy for years to come. The term free means that nations should be free from external coercion and also internally free in terms of good governance, fundamental freedoms, transparency, and anti-corruption. Open means that the region's sea lines and airways should remain open. The region should enjoy more open infrastructure connectivity, and the investment environment should be free, fair, and reciprocal. I should note that this strategy includes empowering regional institutions that already promote these principles. ASEAN and its related mechanisms are essential to the freedom and openness of its 10 members, and ASEAN's centrality is an important element of the Indo-Pacific strategy. The success of the Indo-Pacific strategy will depend on its implementation. Over the last few months, we've seen the administration move from a period of strategic formulation for Asia into the implementation phase. Congress is playing a major role as well. On the security side, the United States is promoting freedom and openness in the Indo-Pacific in a variety of ways. Unilaterally, we have stepped up our freedom of navigation operations and presence through the region. On a bilateral and multilateral basis, the United States is taking a more forward-leaning approach to military diplomacy. We are reaching out to new partners. For example, the USS Carl Vinson recently became the first U.S. aircraft carrier to visit Vietnam. And we're also reinforcing norms. For example, by finally disinviting China from RIMPAC after years of territorial aggression. We are also undergoing region-wide military capacity building programs throughout the Maritime Security Initiative and other funding streams to empower the smaller nations of the region to protect their own interests. On the cultural and people-to-people side, the United States already has world-class exchanges and related programs that have advanced the principles of freedom and openness for years, and these programs will continue to receive broad support in Congress. In the long term, the economic component of the Indo-Pacific strategy will be the most meaningful. This summer, the administration announced the Indo-Pacific Economic Vision, a development assistance initiative focusing on digital economy, energy, and infrastructure that begins with $113 million in investment this year. Combined with our existing assistance programs and other agencies like the MCC, we have granted $2.1 billion in Indo-Pacific nations since 2014. The United States will continue to be a major player in development assistance in the Indo-Pacific. But the exciting thing to remember is that traditional development assistance is not the most important part of our economic strategy for the Indo-Pacific. The private sector commands far greater resources than any government's foreign assistance budget, and unlocking private sector investment is the answer to the Indo-Pacific's development needs. I'm honored to be the House sponsor of the BUILD Act, which has already passed the House and is currently in the Senate. The BUILD Act will catalyze private sector investment in developing countries by modernizing and expanding the United States Development Finance Toolkit. Our tools for the development finance are dispersed across too many federal agencies and need to be streamlined. The primary U.S. development agency, OPIC, has not been significantly updated since its creation in 1971. As you can imagine, the landscape of the developing world has changed since the 70s. In recent years, private sector development has overtaken development assistance from donor nations as the most important source of funding in developing nations. Many traditional donor nations have acknowledged this reality and created robust development finance mechanisms. It's past time the United States does the same. The BUILD Act will create a new development finance corporation by consolidating OPIC with other development finance capabilities, creating management efficiencies, improving oversight, and allowing greater flexibility. This new institution will be able to partner with other development institutions, such as the Japan Bank for International Cooperation. And most importantly, the House passed legislation would more than double the United States development finance capacity to $60 billion. This empowered development finance agency that is created by the BUILD Act, will be a counter to China's One Belt, One Road. In fact, Secretary Pompeo testified before the House Foreign Affairs Committee that he believes the new DFC will be able to compete with China dollar for dollar. through its capacity to team up with other DFCs and leverage the private sector. There is truth to the saying that a rising tide lifts all boats. 43 of the top 50 consumer nations of American agricultural products were once U.S. foreign aid recipients. The BUILD Act will help generate more of these opportunities by helping nations in the Indo-Pacific and around the world attract the high standards, market-driven investments they need to grow. We hope the BUILD Act will be a major pathway for Indo-Pacific's rising power to transition from aid to trade. Thank you.
Brian's not able to take questions. However, if you do have questions, on the info sheet that we passed out, there is a contact address to get in touch with us, and I will put you in touch with Brian and Representative Yoho's office to have your questions answered.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Just email and we'll get the answers as best we can. But thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Brian.
So many Brians.
So we're going to take a very brief break to rearrange the stage and prepare for our panel.
A cop? Sure. I can.
It'll be less than 1 minute, I assure you.
As soon as I get back to the. Oh, that's fine. I'll wait. I don't have to rush.
You go get the mic.
Thank you.
Yeah, come on. Do you have a card?
Yeah. Let me. Sure. Let me go over here to my desk. Let me go to my coffee. Can I get a coffee for anybody? Oh, hey, what's up, man? How you doing? I wasn't looking up. I was supposed to show up today and take photographs, and then they told me I'm giving the speech. I'm like, what? This was not in the brochure. There you go. Oh, sorry about that. I'm just in pass-out mode here.
I'm from Vietnam Embassy.
Oh, sure.
Yes, that's why we have very much interest in this.
Sure, yeah. I will send you, as soon as I get back to the office, I'll send out a copy. Brian has actually copies of it on his desk, so.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Not a problem. I'm sorry he couldn't be here.
Yeah.
I know that, they called votes, so there were supposed to be 4 of us with him, and like I said, I was supposed to take photographs, and they told me I was giving it. I'm like, I felt like.
I think the remarks is
Yeah.
very interesting.
Oh, okay, yeah. I'm glad you like them.
Yeah, and I think we really appreciate it. We can have the full copy of the remarks so that.
Yeah. I can just give you a copy as prepared. So, okay. Oh, is it still on?
It's still on you.
Oh, I was like, I thought I shut it off.
You probably did. I just wanted to collect it since I know you have to run off soon. So.
Now you can be off record.
Oh, it wasn't? Okay. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I will email it to you.
Yes, thank you so much. Yes, just that button.
Okay, if our panelists could join us at the front, we'll resume our event. Connor, could I have you join us here? Harry? Courtney, could you assure that Simona has a mic? Okay.
Should we test? I think it works.
So green is on. You might need a battery.
Hello.
So we've introduced some, I would say, exciting opportunities today with our keynotes discussing the BUILD Act, discussing programs like ITAN, Asia Edge, and hopefully our panelists from the private sector and those who have been watching these closely can shed some more light and provide more context. But we've convened the private sector panel to talk about both opportunities and challenges, because this is a realm that the U.S. really hasn't been robustly involved in for arguably decades. I believe it's the infrastructure and development finance sector is something that we kind of wrestled ourselves out of because we learned some hard lessons, again, decades ago. So we're going to jump into this pool again. I believe it's important to hear about the challenges and explore the some of the obstacles that the private sector might encounter on the road to deepening this approach. Today we've convened 3 panelists for you. And panelists, I'm going to hold you to 8 minutes, as we talked about, because we're a little bit over time. And I think, unfortunately, we're going to go a little bit over time today as well. If you have to leave right at 4:30, but by all means, please do so. I believe we'll end about 10 minutes past schedule. Today we've convened a panel, again, of private sector representatives. First, we have Connor Savoy, Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Global Innovation Fund here in Washington, D.C. Connor is the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Global Innovation Fund. He brings a decade of policy analysis and research experience. And also, prior to joining the Global Innovation Fund, he served as the Deputy Director of the Project on Prosperity and Development at CSIS just around the corner. At CSIS, Connor helped build an innovative research program focused on the evolving role of the private sector in international development. Following Connor's presentation, we'll hear from Harry Achutan, who is the CEO and the founder of Convault Energy. Prior to founding Convault, Harry was a director at Credit Suisse Asset Management in the alternative investment group, where he covered hedge fund, real estate, and private equity strategies. I think for us, most interestingly, Harry and Convault is a renewable power powerhouse, a company now that is developing assets in kind of very interesting parts of the world, in Southeast Asia and Africa. Convault was the first to successfully develop a large utility-scale project, solar project in Myanmar, and also has a few projects under development in Lao PDR, first American companies to do so. In Africa, Convault is developing projects in Nigeria, Tanzania, Chad, and Sierra Leone. And Harry represents, I would say, a medium-sized enterprise looking to do the things that these development finance programs are seeking to do. So it's important to hear a voice from, I would say, a medium enterprise to these opportunities and challenges. And finally, we have joining us Simona Guha, Vice President of the Albright Stonebridge Group. Simona, at Albright Stonebridge, draws on 20 years of experience in Europe and South Asia and advises clients on market entry and expansion, including political and regulatory strategies. She held key positions in the White House and the State Department, and was also the Senior Director at the U.S.-India Business Council, where she focused on infrastructure, energy, and manufacturing, and launched an Indo-Pacific initiative to promote economic connectivity across the region. These are our panelists. We're going to turn to Connor first.
Thanks, Brian. It's great to be here today, and it's great to be at Stimpson as an admirer of Henry Stimpson. It's wonderful to be up here on this stage, and I think when you think about the role that Henry Stimpson played in bringing a bipartisan face to the Roosevelt war effort in 1941, I am, in many ways, the Build Act is really emblematic of that bipartisan support that has long been a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy. And I think what's been so, not only what it will do for U.S. development finance capabilities, but it also heartens me that there are still some of these bipartisan efforts around Washington. And I know that Representative Yoho has been a real champion of this. And in talking to his staff, they've worked closely with the Democratic members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. They've worked closely with their Senate colleagues. And so it is really, the Build Act truly is a bipartisan effort. And I think it really does represent the best of bipartisan efforts around U.S. foreign policy. Briefly, who am I, or what is my organization? The Global Innovation Fund is an early-stage investor. We're supported by a group of bilateral donors, including USAID and UK DFID. We operate across West Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and generally we're making investments in sort of the seed to Series A, Series B round of financing for entrepreneurs. Why are we interested in the Build Act and the DFI conversation that we're engaged in today? There's a real gap that exists, and we try to help fill this gap. Most DFIs, OPIC included, development finance institutions, find it difficult to provide financing at this early stage. And so there is a lot of let's call it challenge fund or early grant financing that's often available to help people who have the kernel of an idea and are still trying to prove their concept before they go to market. When they go to market, in most of the countries that we operate in, there's very limited financing available. So if you look at a country like Nigeria, the cost of capital is immensely high. To borrow in the local currency, an entrepreneur would have to pay 20-25% interest rate. To most of us, that seems pretty high, and it is very high, and it's very difficult then for them to advance. A lot of people would then say, well, let's turn to the DFIs. They could provide that source of capital for these companies to grow. The trouble is that many DFIs find it very difficult to, quote unquote, go down market, so to speak. Deals at this stage are small. Our average deal size is about $2 or $3 million. Most DFIs, IFC, OPIC, find it very difficult to go below $10 million and really even below 50. And that's because the cost of due diligence is very high, which increases the cost for them to actually finance a project. They also look at many of these ventures as being too risky. Early stage, there's a high failure rate. If you talk to a Silicon Valley VC firm, they'll tell you if we get 1 or 2 out of 10 successes, that's great. That's a really good rate for them. So many DFIs are sort of scared off by the risk associated in this. So what that means is there is this large gap. And I think what a group like GIF is interested in is how can we help to build a pipeline of companies that can then ultimately transition to DFI and then ultimately move on to commercial stage financing. And so we do work very closely with OPIC. We work closely with IFC, CDC, FMO, the whole alphabet soup of European development finance institutions. On the Build Act side of things, I think what I find and what my group finds so interesting, and I should be clear, we don't endorse particular pieces of legislation, but we have been very supportive of the Build Act, and we have engaged on the Hill with staff talking about what this might look like. We've talked with members of the administration in terms of what some of the goals should be behind it. What we find most interesting is this is really going to move, I think, as you heard Congressman Yoho's communications director said, this is going to move OPIC from a 1970s paradigm of financing to what we need to do right now, to the 21st century. It will give it equity authority. It will give it the ability to lend in local currency. It will give it the ability to make grants where necessary to support technical assistance. It will also consolidate most development finance, U.S. development finance capabilities under one roof, which should theoretically improve the efficiency and effectiveness of U.S. development finance overall. I think there is this broader strategic overlay. And in the conversation around the Build Act, the focus has been largely on the role that China plays now in financing projects in the developing world. I think both Cleet Willems and Congressman Yoho's communications director did a great job of setting the stage for why this will do things differently. And I think what I've said throughout this process is we really should focus on selling what our comparative advantage is vis-a-vis the Chinese. The Chinese, by and large, provide large state-to-state infrastructure financing packages, right? So these are government-to-government loans. They're often backed by some kind of in-kind repayment through commodities, whether it's oil or other natural resources. And this is why it's creating in many instances, it's creating an unsustainable debt servicing for countries like Sri Lanka and Pakistan and some in sub-Saharan Africa. That's not what the Build Act will do. That's not what the United States will do. This is about enabling the private sector with finance to grow, to build long-term economic growth, generate jobs, and drive the investment that these countries need in order to be put onto a sustainable path. I think, as you heard, development finance has changed fundamentally in the last 2 decades. Official development assistance is now a small piece. If you look at U.S. financial flows, it's only about 9%. That other 90% or so is made up of various private flows, whether it's foreign direct investment, remittances, philanthropy, and other types of private spending. And that's really, at the end of the day, that's what we're going to do. The Chinese are not providing this in most of the countries that they're operating in. They are not providing private sector financing. And that's really, I think, where the BUILD Act, the new International Development Finance Corporation, could make a big impact. The second thing I would say is, with China, what you often hear is they're offering these countries a package deal. It's everything. It's financing, it's the construction, it's the technical assistance, it's the whole kit and caboodle. And I think for us, we need to think much more about how we can do a better job of offering that package as we look at the countries that we're cooperating with across the world. The DFC is only a small piece of this. We need to think about how we're drawing together the DFC with USAID, with MCC, with the State Department, with the Commerce Department, with USTDA, and others. We have a fragmented system. That's the reality of it. But we do need to think harder about, when we're looking at a partner such as in Indonesia or the Philippines or Ghana or Nigeria, are we offering them, are we ensuring that what we're offering is coordinated and moving in the direction of a unified objectives? The DFC will not solve this on its own. This is why this Indo-Pacific strategy and some of the other efforts, part of it has to be to draw these things together. If you go back and look at what the Obama administration attempted to do through economic statecraft and some of these things, these were good first efforts. They didn't get all the way to where they needed to be. I think if you look at something like Power Africa, this was an effort to draw together multiple agencies around one goal, increasing access to power in sub-Saharan Africa. Again, it's not perfect, but I think that it was moving in the right direction, and it does continue to this day, which is good. I would also just add before I close, there's a multilateral dimension to all of this, and at the end of the day, the United States is the largest or second largest shareholder in all of the multilateral development banks around the world, whether it's the World Bank or the regional development banks. These institutions, for better or for worse, remain a large source of capital for infrastructure projects in developing countries. I believe we need to do a better job of driving a reform agenda to ensure that these institutions are meeting their client states where they need to be. If you think about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, China's New Development Bank, these two institutions, those largely grew out of frustrations with the existing multilateral development banks. They grew out of frustrations around the U.S. inability to pass IMF quota reform, and they grew out of a perceived frustration that these institutions moved too slowly in terms of approving financing for infrastructure deals. So there is a need for what the AIIB is doing, but there is also a need, I think, for us to try to ensure that the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank are streamlined in their approach, and we should renew our leadership around these institutions, because this has to be part of the broader package deal that we're offering. So I think with that, let me just close by saying, I think the DFC, I think if it gets done, it will be a sea change. Brian's right about that. I think it will absolutely be a sea change. If for any other reason, it will give us new and improved instruments that we didn't have before, and it will enable us to work more closely with our allies. And it will also increase the amount of financing available. But I really do believe that we would be leaving a lot on the table if we weren't thinking seriously about where the DFC fits in as part of a broader strategy and an improved partnership package that we're offering the people, our emerging partners across the developing world. So thanks again, Brian, for having me here today.
Thank you.
over to you.
Harry, if you'd like to, I know it's hard to see the visuals there, so if you'd like to stand up and direct that, that's fine. Do you have a clicker?
I don't. But great. Let's see if this works. All right, I'm going to begin by saying I'm human, I'm conflicted, I'm biased. So, so we started our firm in 2012, and we went into Myanmar right when the sanctions were suspended. So we were one of the first in Myanmar to develop a renewable power project, and I think we've learned a lot. Since then, this is going to be a bit hard to view. We're developing quite a large project in Laos, which is basically developing renewable power in Laos and selling to Vietnam, since Vietnam has the majority of the needs in the region. So if you actually look at it, we proposed this plan, which is a backbone transmission plan, and Laos does not have a transmission network that runs north to south. So about 2 years ago, we presented this plan to the Lao government to basically build a 1,650-kilometer backbone to carry the power from Laos down to Vietnam, all the way down to Ho Chi Minh City. Ho Chi Minh City is severely short on power. 65% of the demand in Vietnam is coming out of this region, and there's really no network that can actually take it down. So we actually are developing a solar power plant here. Unfortunately, the region is in the news with the break of a hydropower dam very recently. So we're dealing with those challenges. And this project is about $3.5 billion, and the Chinese, same project, Chinese are pricing it at $6.5 billion. So you can actually see the disparity, between what we're proposing versus what the Chinese are proposing. So I'm going to dovetail this into financing, and I'm going to try to cut it down from 8 minutes down to 6 minutes, so we have more time for questions. I'll give you an example. The Myanmar project, I'm a former banker, and I thought I've seen a lot until you actually start a company and you go to financing. A lot of it is not what it seems, and the deal on the table constantly changes, especially when you're dealing with DFIs. One of the biggest disadvantages that we have had is not having a very strong U.S. institution that just steps up to the plate and says, this is how we're going to do it. We're going to back the American firms. We're going to fund this project, and we're going to move forward with it. That has been one of the biggest challenges that we have had. Why is that? I think it's management by exception. Every administration, the last administration, they did a great job at the time that they were in. And leave everything aside, I think this administration has got this right. China, and we face it. I can tell you this plan was copied, and today, I don't know if I'm going to win this deal. I don't know if we're going to be able to implement this. We're working with the Lao government, with the Vietnam government, but I can tell you how complex it is to get two governments to agree, and then you've got this guy here who's got 20 gigawatts of extra capacity of power that wants to build this transmission line and take this power at 3 cents and take it down to Vietnam. For the next 5 years, they'll give you 3 cents. And what happens? In the middle of this, for the next 5 years, almost every project in Laos is dead. So you begin with, I'm going to build this transmission line. I'm going to give you cheap power. Take the cheap power. And you will do that. And then 5 years later, you'll find out that they just raised the prices. And when they raise the prices, it'll be impossible for you to build these projects in a short period of time to satisfy the power. And we keep advising them that you need another alternative, and you can't just, think China, China, China. And what we say is, look, fine, split this thing up. Split it up, give them the north, give us the south, let's do business. And if you actually look at it, the conversation from the northern partner is it's all or nothing. You don't need them, right? We say, let's work together. The northern partner is, you don't need anybody. You just need us, because their strategy is very different. When you've got a single-party system, you can have a 200-year plan, and you can execute flawlessly, and that's basically their agenda. So what we're missing is basically the DFC, and we think that's what's needed. The fact that you can't take equity, I think that's changed, and I think you've got the right person there now, Ray Washburn, to lead this agency, and it's time that we actually stepped up and did it. I'll tell you what, if the U.S. wanted to do it, you can annihilate any other organization that funds these projects. China is not cheap. You go through the transaction. In the end, Sinosure comes in and says, I'm going to slap on a 7% charge on the entire project value. You think Japan is great with its low debt. Fantastic. You get low debt, and then they slap on this political risk insurance, which is about time and a half what it needs to be. So in the end, you end up paying the same amount of rate that you pay. If we really wanted to do this, we can flip this thing in 2 seconds. We just go in and say, you know what, Treasury plus 100 basis points. We're going to do this deal. We're going to take this down. If you want to do it, we could do it. But in order to do that, you need an organization that is ready, that has got the capacity, and that has the willpower to go out and do it. And I think the time is right. So if you actually look at our Myanmar transaction, we brought in the government of Finland as a co-investor along with us. OPEC cannot do equity, so we needed somebody else to step in. But if I look at the Indo-Pacific region, I see these organizations, and I actually left out one flag, which is the Aussie flag. I think EFIC would be a very good institution to go along with it. I think the Japanese are great. And let's not forget, Southeast Asia, especially us as Americans who are walking into the region, the war is still fresh in their minds. A lot of these government officials were young during the time of war, so their view of America is very different, and we have to earn their trust by just being there for them, talking to them, and bringing in partners like Japan, like Korea, like Australia. We have to do this together, and I think the Indo-Pacific strategy is spot on. I'm telling you this from what I see on the ground, what we face on a day-to-day basis. There's your Belt and Road Initiative. I don't think this is updated. I think I got this picture from the internet somewhere like an hour and a half ago. I'm sure like Africa is annihilated here somewhere. And if you want a recent case study, Djibouti. I don't know how many of you have actually heard about it, but if you want what not to do, Djibouti is what not to do. I don't know how many of you actually know that China State Grid actually controls the Philippines grid, and I can tell you why they do that. So anyway, all I'm here to say is it comes down to financing, and it comes down to innovative ideas around how do you go out and build capacity in these countries. So I'll stop. I know we're running out of time, and I'm sure there will be questions.
Thank you, Harry.
You're welcome.
Simona.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. In the interest of time, I was asked to speak about a little bit about the strategy behind the Indo-Pacific Initiative and some of the diplomacy that's going on behind it. I'm going to condense those remarks and get to my last piece, which is recommendations on what both governments and the private sector can do to move it forward. I completely agree with Connor that this is a refreshing example of an initiative with bipartisan support. And I'm fascinated to hear from Hari some of the concrete examples of the challenges you face in investing in some of these, we call them regional economic connectivity projects, but just the realities, the practical realities of doing this. This is a very complex endeavor. And so in terms of, the strategy, I think one thing that we haven't touched on in the discussion today is that, the U.S. does work with allies and like-minded partners in Asia on a range of issues, security-related issues, and that cooperation has traditionally been much more developed. And so it has been a challenge to translate cooperation on things like freedom of navigation, maritime security, to translate that into an economic cooperation program that is really effective. And so it is encouraging to see all of these programs that the administration has put forth that we've been discussing today. It's also important to keep in mind that each of the countries, many of the partners that we work with in Asia, have their own regional economic connectivity visions. I can speak to India, which I've worked on extensively, under Prime Minister Modi, really sees developing economic connections with India's neighbors as a way to increase India's regional leadership and global leadership. Japan, similarly, Prime Minister Abe has spent quite a bit of time working on these initiatives, and so to dovetail all of these things, I mean, again, the strategic interests are converging, but how do you translate that into an economic vision? In terms of the recommendations, again, in the interest of time, I think what we're seeing is an openness, as we heard from our keynote speakers, to listen to industry, to incorporate industry perspectives as they develop this strategy and as they implement the programs. But we've also heard they know that they are relying on industry. None of these programs will succeed with official development assistance, as we've discussed. They are really relying on industry to get it done. So it's really in their interest to develop these programs in a way that will incentivize industry to invest more. And so what does this mean? How can we take this forward? I think, again, you're seeing this openness from the administration, but having been in government and now being outside of government, you know that industry often finds access to government very difficult. It's very opaque. Could we think about, sort of a one-stop shop for industry to go to the designated agency or representative as the administration is putting forward its sort of whole-of-government strategy? Where should the private sector go to understand what is coming online for them? How can we create or support a regular dialogue between companies and the U.S. government to make sure that industry avails itself of new opportunities? We know that companies are generally interested in the Indo-Pacific strategy, but they need to ask, will this lead to new business opportunities for me? This is the question we hear. And so I think as you see the U.S. government trying to create these opportunities, that communication is very important. And the same goes for Japan, for India. We know that there are strong mechanisms in Australia. So it's really an effort that cuts across the United States, but I think it's important to set that out at the outset that you need that two-way street. And look, in some cases, these infrastructure investments that the countries in the Indo-Pacific need, and we've talked about the vast needs, some $26 trillion by 2030 just to keep up with growth. The conversations about the conditions that are needed to attract investment, these are conversations that have been going on a long time. So in a way, highlighting the political imperative of the Indo-Pacific strategy now is a way to bring up conversations on good governance, reliable and predictable investment climate, and other factors that industry would like to see in many of these countries in any case. And then lastly, I'll echo Connor's points on the role of the international financial institutions, which have a long history of doing this type of infrastructure development. They have experience in putting together consortiums for long-term projects that involve multiple governments, that involve multiple companies that each take a piece of the project. And so to the extent we can leverage their expertise and really use that going forward and use the U.S. influence to shape those outcomes, I think that is also an important implementation goal for the Indo-Pacific strategy. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. So we've got about 12 minutes, and I had a few questions that I wanted to pose to the group to kind of get a group discussion going, but we'll forego those and turn this over to you. But before we do that, by no means is this new strategy starting from scratch, right? There's already a strong foundation of developers looking and developing projects in the Indo-Pacific, of financiers who have been active in the region and know the lay of the land very well, and then also of economic development strategies and existing frameworks out there for which these programs can latch onto. And I'm thinking about the U.S.'s Lower Mekong Initiative, which has been around now for about 10 years, which does have an infrastructure element to it. The ADB's Greater Mekong Subregion Program and other ADB regional programs. And some emerging or rather resurrected programs like Thailand's ACMEX program, which is kind of a self-led or regional-led a program that looks to develop countries in mainland Southeast Asia by convening key actors in the stronger states of Southeast Asia like Thailand and Vietnam. So there's plenty of there to latch onto. So as we get into this discussion, let's remember that the building blocks are already there. I think what we're looking to do is to accelerate U.S. involvement in the region and deepen our involvement and link in with cooperative partnerships. Questions from the audience? Richard.
Yes, thank you. I'm Richard. Sorry. I'm Richard Cronin. I'm a fellow at Stimson. I was previously had Brian's job as director of the Southeast Asia program. I think that I have a couple questions that everything that's been said is very interesting and tracks, with each other. But a couple of questions. One is China is soaking up bankability of developing governments. In other words, they're getting tapped out. Laos is a great example of how much more debt they can stand. And it's not like there isn't capital around for infrastructure projects, but for instance, the Asian Development Bank or the World Bank talk about the lack of bankable projects. So the projects have to be quick return or fairly quick return, et cetera. But the question for the U.S. then is, how do we address the bankability issues if we have good projects? Sufficiency of financing, which I haven't heard any big numbers thrown around yet, and terms of what our loans would be, et cetera. And then what part of the DFA would actually lobby projects with the governments, and how is that all to be coordinated, which someone has just talked about. And then just finally a comment that we've been talking about cooperation with our allies for decades. I've been in this business at least 40 years or more. The problem is that we all have different business models of our governments and our aid programs. And I have yet to see any really successful effort at joint development, financing, and cooperation. So I'm open to ideas about that. Thank you.
And Rich, was your question to anyone or?
I think whoever wants to.
Okay.
I think say Connor and Simona probably the best.
Sure. Why don't I? So a couple things. I think what you're getting at a little bit is the sustainability. Like, could they actually absorb the financing that we're talking about right now? And I think it's important to differentiate who the new DFC would be working with. Unlike the China model, it's not going to be largely a state-to-state model. It really is going to be working either with U.S. So OPIC has a hard U.S. ownership requirement. At least 25%. U.S. person must own at least 25%. Is that right?
I think it's a total of 30%.
Is it 30%?
Does the Build Act change this?
So the Build Act does change it. It now moves to a preference for some kind of U.S. ownership. So there's no longer I guess, a hard hurdle, if you want to say that. So I think you really do have to remember that it is going to be less about financing to governments and much more about to private sector actors. And I also think, again, when you talk, you're right. I think there really is no necessarily lack of, there is a lot of financing out there, and the bank is fond of saying there's a need for more bankable projects. But my own preference and my sort of, when I've talked about the BUILD Act, is it will do infrastructure. I know the new DFC, the OPIC does infrastructure now, but I also think that when you look at, that's not the totality of what OPIC does, and that shouldn't be the totality of what the DFC does. It's not the totality of what all DFIs do. There is this very important piece of helping build sustainable businesses in these countries, support for investment, for fintech or agricultural investment, things like that. That, in many ways, I've argued, is where the comparative advantage is going to be. It's going to be, the total amount OPIC right now is a upper limit of $29 billion in terms of what it can have on its books. The BUILD Act will increase that to $60 billion, and it will actually peg it to the rate of inflation, which is not something that OPIC has had in the past. OPIC's credit limit or financing limit was last raised in, I think, 1997 or 98 or something like that. Right now, it's committed about $23 billion of that 29, so there's not much space left. And it will have the ability to, I believe, based on what the percentage is, to do about $8 billion a year in new commitments. In terms of the length of tenors, OPIC loans are usually, 15 to 20 years? You know this better.
Tail minus 10.
All right, there you go. So I think this one, the BUILD Act won't change that. It'll be similar. And just, I don't want to take up too much time, but in terms of examples of where we could cooperate, I think that happens a lot on the project level, on a sort of deal-by-deal basis. I can tell you, GIF has an investment in an agricultural franchise service in northern Nigeria, and we provided a local currency loan that then unlocked, it was a subordinate debt position that then unlocked a bunch of senior dollar-denominated debt, and there's three other DFIs in it, CDC, FMO, and OPIC, and actually IFC, so there's 4 DFIs in it. What you hear from other DFIs is OPIC is very difficult to invest alongside because OPIC must always take a senior U.S. dollar-denominated position, has to always be paid back first. That's the rules that it operates under, and it makes it very difficult. It also only can invest with debt. It can't take an equity position, and again, that makes it very difficult when you're looking at other deal structures for it to work alongside others. I know that with the European development finance institutions, there is a lot of interest in this because they believe it will make it easier to come in alongside them, and they want to invest alongside U.S. Now, that said, they have their objectives, we have our objectives, and it is always difficult to do it. But I think on a sort of deal-by-deal basis, that happens a lot.
I'm just going to jump in very quickly. Every DFI has its own agenda, and that's one of the reasons why we need a strong DFC. And the second point is, at the current moment, OPIC cannot be in a consortium loan. They cannot be in a consortium. So if there's a pool of lenders, OPIC runs a parallel loan, pari passu. So they can't be part of that. So you have 2 cost structures.
Is that changing?
That should, hopefully. It should. It will.
The only thing I'd add to that is that now that you have this sort of political commitment by the U.S. government and with Japan, with India, there is a possibility, and there is a trilateral infrastructure working group among those 3 countries to look at pilot projects, to look at pilots that they deem, projects that they deem strategic. And then if you have those new authorities in the United States, or if other countries choose to use their development authorities, you can push forward with a political level of support for certain projects.
Another question.
Thanks. Paul Murphy, Gowling, WLG. We're an international law firm. In the prior set of questions, there was reference to terms. So will this new institution be part of the OECD guidelines, or will it be outside of the guidelines so that it can be, take maybe more aggressive positions if we're trying to promote possible projects? I mean, a lot of it depends on the terms that the financing comes with. Political risk insurance. Well, how much does it cost? If it's cheap, that's going to promote more activity by developers. If it's expensive and it's a risky situation, then they may say, well, we can't go. So, what's going to be the level of aggressiveness of this new institution, and how will it, if we really want to do deals in certain places, it would seem like, the cheaper the financing, the better the rates on insurance, et cetera. Well, then you can go in. It's just a question of how badly you want to do it. So what's the sense that if we assume this gets passed and goes into effect, how is it going to behave? Because, we've seen, like with the DOE loan guarantee program, sometimes you'll see situations where they behave like a commercial bank, give the same terms, assess risk a certain way, and then it becomes too expensive from a financing perspective. If they lowered the charge on the financing, the project would have gone forward.
All right. I mean, it's going to come down to a political decision. Do we want to be active in Southeast Asia and Africa? Do we want to support American businesses in these countries? Do we want to do that? If the answer is, so let's go through a process rationalization, right? The answer is yes, then what does it take to be competitive? If the answer is no, drop it, let China run the table, right? So the question again is, and the argument that we're making is, we need a strong development finance institution if you want American business to be active. And we commit a certain amount of U.S. content that goes along with that, right? We've got about 2.5 gigawatts of solar projects under development. And I think if we can get financial closes and get done on 1 or 2 of them, and let's say 500 megawatts is up and running, it doesn't stop us from actually setting up our own factory, because for the next 7 years, we can supply 300 to 400 megawatts per year for the next 7 years to our own projects. And that's new business generated in America, new jobs, new growth. We can do that. We don't have to be dependent on the Chinese, where you've got volatility in prices depending on what they want to do, and that's also a very political decision from their side. So I think the answer to that question is, do we have the political wherewithal to actually say we want to be in these countries and we want American businesses to be there? And if the answer is yes, then make the rates competitive. Now, that being said, I still have not figured this out, and I'm still trying to figure this out. All the institutions want a sovereign guarantee, okay? They want a sovereign guarantee, right, for all these projects, project finance, classic project finance. So why is political risk insurance expensive when you've got a sovereign guarantee from a government? Why do you even need political risk insurance? I don't know the answer to this. I'm still trying to figure this out. And if somebody can help me understand this, that would be great. But I have not been able to dissect this at all. Whatever arguments have been put forth to me, it's not testing. I just can't validate it, right? But I don't know. Maybe I'm missing something. That comes down to competitiveness. But it purely is, do we have the political wherewithal to do it? And I think this administration is moving in the right direction. I think.
I'd agree with that. I mean, I think it's ultimately, it comes down to politics. And I think reading the tea leaves, and I don't like to make predictions anymore after 2016, but, I think based on what I've heard from people on the Hill who have been working on this, and based on the people who have been driving this, within the administration, there is a desire to be competitive. There is a desire to ensure that this institution takes more risk than OPIC right now is willing to do, and than other DFIs are necessarily willing to do. If you look at the legislation, there's strong preference to see this operating less in, let's say, safer emerging market economies where you might be more willing to invest as an individual, and more in much more frontier-like settings. And I mean, that's where the financing need is, and that's where the competition is with China right now.
At the end of the day, we're underwriting at least 40% of the political risk. So you got three institutions. You got OPIC, you got MIGA, and JBIC offers political risk insurance, JBIC Nexi. So out of the three, we are into 100%, and the other one, whatever our ratio is in the World Bank, what is it, 40%, 30%? I don't know what. I don't know the number. 15%. So we're underwriting that risk anyway, in some way, shape, or form. We may as well as, if we're going to underwrite the risk, why don't we just support American jobs and American projects that contribute to it versus it. I'll give you an example. We have a project in Myanmar, a fiber optic project. We wanted to wire up the city of Yangon. It was our idea. We were the first ones in, did everything, right? Our project is getting canceled. The Chinese have jumped up, took our idea, ran with it. Our project is getting canceled. And guess who is underwriting the risk insurance for that? Megan, go figure this out.
I'm going to call on Courtney to see if we have any questions coming in from Twitter. All right, so let's take one more question.
Brian, I'd like to come back to one comment on OPIC. I think we do have to keep in mind, although we've all discussed this is a great development, what they're trying to do with the build legislation, at the end of the day, there will be certain parameters on what they can do, and they will, the private sector will have to come to them and say, this is the project I have in mind. Does it fit your parameters? Can you support it? I think you will find an open door. I think OPIC is very interested in hearing from industry, but at the end of the day, there will be certain parameters, and projects will have to fit into those parameters in order to get the support.
Okay. Any final questions or comments? Alvin? You'll have the last. Alvin Campbell, you'll have the last word.
Thanks. Hi, yeah, I'm Alvin Campbell. I'm from Johns Hopkins University. I'm curious about, is there policy space for civil society organization in the BUILD Act in the Development Finance Corporation in terms of influencing future projects and terms and activities, especially when the Asian Development Bank took 20, 30 years before it included like civil society, and one of the biggest criticisms against like Chinese projects is that they exclude civil society. Thanks.
One comment on that I'll make is that if you've read the legislation, you'll see that it does include best practices in international development in terms of meeting environmental standards, meeting labor standards, and so that is the type of development that the U.S. wants to support. Obviously, all of those things are, as a result, and closely related to work civil society has done over several decades.
Yeah, I would just add on that. I think there was actually a little bit of a controversy initially about whether or not OPIC's very high standards on that side would actually transfer along with other authorities. And so there was an effort to actively spell that out in the legislation. And that really was the result of civil society, development organizations, other advocates engaging with legislative staff to say, look, we understand what you're trying to do, but let's not throw the family silver out the window, because OPIC has built up, very high standards around this, and we shouldn't throw those out. So.
All right, Professor Chen, thanks.
Ping-Hui Chen, visiting fellow at Stimson. There are some Chinese scholars trying to put forward strategies to counteract the Indo-Pacific strategy. So I would like to hear your opinion about whether how China would change its behavior or not, because we have been talking about this China model for a while. But since the U.S. is going to join again, how would you expect China to react?
Well, that's an interesting question, because Representative Yoho's communications director said that the BUILD Act is purposed to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative. So then we're looking at a counter to the counter. Thoughts?
You want to go?
Look, I mean, I think the reality is that yes, this is a clear reaction to what you see with China's Belt and Road Initiative and all of the financing it's been offering in Africa for the last 15 years or so. This is obviously not. It's not the sole. I mean, it's not. I don't know how China would necessarily change its behavior. I think that there is an overall desire to see them adopt some more of the international standards, similar to how the World Bank operates. I think there was a lot of sense that the AIIB was going to sort of all of a sudden just be financing coal plants and all this sort of horrible stuff around the world. Didn't really happen the way a lot of people thought it would. They actually have adopted standards around, environmental, social, and governance guidelines similar to what the World Bank and the other multilaterals. They've hired a lot of staff who have a background whether at the Asian Development Bank or at World Bank or the other MDBs. So, I think on that you did sort of see like maybe they were willing to meet the international community halfway. Obviously, 57 countries joined it, some of whom were our closest allies. I do think that we should all be realistic that there is a political dimension to the BUILD Act in terms of how you're selling it and how you're getting people to sign on to it. And for a significant number of people, they want to see that this is how we are going to counter China. They want that, and that's why they're signing up to this legislation. I have always been very sort of cautious to say, yes, we can. It would be good, but it's not going to be. It shouldn't be seen as the only objective of this legislation,
and
or
also,
the strategy for that matter.
I don't think we're necessarily looking at a zero-sum game with the BUILD Act. The gap is huge. The amount of stakeholders that are active now can't fill that gap. There must be more unlocked over time. What I don't think an outcome of this will be is some type of cooperation between the United States and China, but rather a set of actions that provide countries in the Indo-Pacific with more choices, better options, competitive options that result in more sustainable outcomes for economic development. We're going to end things here. I want to thank all of our panelists for coming out today, and our keynote speakers and all of you for contributing in this conversation. The Stimson Center has a really deep bench in terms of Indo-Pacific analysis. We've got a strong Southeast Asia program, an East Asia program, and a South Asia program that are all equally engaged on these emerging programs. So you're going to see more from us going into the fall and into 2019. We're ready to engage with stakeholders on identifying impact zones where a difference can be made for the U.S. In these strategies, as well as convening more events like this one that we had today. Thank you again for coming out.